May 1942, Aberdeen Proving Ground, Maryland. The morning sun cast long shadows across the testing range as Lieutenant Edward Jewell steadied the 5T steel tube against his shoulder. In his hands rested what Army officials would later call one of the war's most revolutionary weapons, though at this moment it was nothing more than scrap metal salvaged from a junk pile, a wooden rifle stock, and a prayer that the contraption wouldn't explode in his face. 24 years old, fresh out of Lehigh University with an engineering degree and 5 Beta Kappa honors, Jewell had been wrestling with an impossible problem for weeks. The shaped charge grenade in his possession could penetrate 4 in of hardened steel. It could stop any tank the Germans had rolling across Europe. But at 312, no soldier could throw it far enough to avoid getting killed by his own target. The Army needed a delivery system. They needed it yesterday, and they needed it to be simple enough that any infantryman could use it without specialized training. O's colleague, Captain Leslie Skinner, stood nearby with a clipboard, watching through field glasses as a Mark IV tank rumbled into position 300 YD downrange. Skinner had recently been promoted to major during the development process, recognition of his critical work on what would become one of the war's most important weapons. At 42, he was a career Army man who had been experimenting with rockets since he was a teenager, back when he accidentally set fire to a hospital roof at Fort Strong, Massachusetts in 1915. His father, an Army surgeon, had been less than pleased. But that youthful fascination with explosives had brought him to this moment, to this weapon that would change infantry warfare forever. The generals gathering behind them had no idea they were about to witness history. Among them was Brigadier General Gladian Marcus Barnes, Chief of Research and Development for Army Ordnance. Barnes had reluctantly agreed to observe this demonstration of what headquarters dismissively called Skinner's toy rocket. The Army had real problems to solve. American forces were woefully unprepared for the mechanized warfare sweeping across Europe and North Africa, while German panzer divisions rolled through Poland, France, and deep into Russia. American infantry had essentially nothing that could stop a tank. Soldiers were being trained to run up and stick magnetic mines on enemy armor. The mortality rate for such tactics was predictably catastrophic. The weapon Jewell hefted looked absurd. A simple tube open at both ends with makeshift sights fabricated that very morning from a bent wire coat hanger. Inside rested a thinned rocket with a shaped charge warhead. The firing mechanism consisted of a dry cell battery and a trigger salvaged from various sources. Nothing about it suggested military precision. Everything about it screamed desperate improvisation. Yet this crude assembly represented months of frustration, failure, and finally breakthrough. The story of how Jewell and Skinner created what would become known as the Bazooka begins not in 1942, but decades earlier in the mind of an American rocket pioneer whose work had been dismissed as fantasy. Robert Goddard had developed rocket-powered weapons during World War I, creating prototypes that could theoretically give infantry portable firepower against fortifications. When the armistice was signed in November 1918, interest evaporated. Why invest in experimental rockets when the war to end all wars had concluded? The research gathered dust in War Department archives for 20 years. By 1940, with German tanks crushing Poland and France, those archives suddenly seemed relevant again. Skinner, stationed at Indian Head Rocket Laboratory in Maryland, began pulling Goddard's old research. The science was sound. Solid fuel rockets could deliver explosive payloads with minimal recoil. The challenge wasn't propulsion. It was creating a warhead powerful enough to penetrate modern tank armor and a launcher simple enough for mass production. The shaped charge principle had been known since the 1880s, when Charles Monroe discovered that explosives with hollow cavities focused their destructive force into a narrow jet. By 1941, American ordnance engineers had refined this into the M10-shaped charge grenade. Tests showed it could burn through armor like a blowtorch. One problem, it weighed too much to throw effectively, and mounting it on a rifle barrel risked injury to the firer from the explosive backblast. Skinner sketched a tube-launched rocket system in December 1940. His superiors told him there was no suitable warhead. When the M10 arrived in 1942, suddenly the impossible seemed merely improbable. Skinner assigned the launcher development tool, who had joined his Special Projects Unit in June 1941. For weeks, Uhl experimented with different configurations. How to shield the operator from rocket exhaust, how to stabilize the projectile in flight, how to make sights accurate enough for combat ranges. The breakthrough came by accident, as many great inventions do. Uhl was walking past a scrap pile at the laboratory when he spotted a steel tube approximately 5 ton long and 60 ms in diameter. Something clicked. He picked it up, held it to his shoulder, and realized it was almost exactly the same diameter as the M10 grenade. The rocket could sit inside the tube. The open rear would vent the exhaust away from the operator. Put a rocket in a tube, point it at a tank, pull a trigger. The fundamental concept was elegantly direct. Yu rushed back to the workshop. Within hours, he had fabricated a crude prototype using the salvaged tube, some wood from spare rifle stocks, and basic grips and trigger mechanisms. The first test would be crucial. If the backblast was too severe, the weapon would be unusable. If the rocket exploded in the tube, the project was dead. Carried his creation down to the Toke River, far from any observers who might question his sanity. He loaded a rocket, pointed the tube across the water, and squeezed the trigger. The rocket wooed out with surprising grace. No violent recoil, no burst of flame in his face, just a smooth launch and a splash in the river hundreds of feet away. Uhl was stunned. He had expected to need protective equipment, maybe a blast shield. But the rocket's propellant burned completely within the tube's length, and what little exhaust escaped vented harmlessly out the rear. A soldier could fire this from his shoulder without injury. He brought the prototype to Skinner the next morning. Together they refined the design, adding proper sights, improving the trigger mechanism, ensuring the electrical firing system could function in combat conditions. They fabricated dummy rockets for safety testing. Everything performed beyond expectations. Now they needed to prove it to the brass. The demonstration at Aberdeen Proving Ground was hastily arranged for May 1942. The Army was conducting trials of various spigot mortars. Bulky crews served weapons that also used shaped charges. Skinner saw an opportunity. He would demonstrate their launcher alongside these established systems. The comparison would either validate their work or expose it as inadequate. As the visiting generals arrived that morning, Skinner realized they had forgotten one critical detail. The launcher had no sights. The wire coat hanger sights had been a last-minute improvisation, bent into shape with a broken nail just hours earlier. No precision instruments, no careful calibration, just a rough approximation of where the rocket might go. The demonstration began with the spigot mortars. 5 different models were tested against the moving tank. Each crew fired multiple rounds. Not a single hit was recorded. The mortars were accurate enough against stationary targets, but tracking a moving vehicle proved beyond their capabilities. The generals looked disappointed but unsurprised. Anti-tank weapons were notoriously difficult to aim under field conditions. Then it was Skinner and O's turn. Skinner shouldered the launcher, tracking the tank as it rumbled across the range. He squeezed the trigger. The rocket leaped from the tube with a distinctive whoosh. Seconds later, it struck the tank's hull with a resounding clang. The generals stirred with interest. Perhaps a lucky shot. Skinner fired again, another hit and again with their improvised wire coat hanger sights and a weapon assembled from scrap metal. Skinner and Uhl hit the moving tank repeatedly, while 5 sophisticated mortars had scored 0 hits. General Barnes stepped forward, fascination evident on his weathered face. The man had seen countless weapons demonstrations over 3 decades of military service. This one was different. He turned to Skinner with a request that was really an order. "Let me try it." Skinner handed over the launcher, walking Barnes through the simple firing procedure. Aim, track the target, squeeze the trigger. Nothing complicated. No lengthy training required. Barnes settled the tube against his shoulder, squinted through the crude sights, and fired. Direct hit. The general's face split into a rare smile. He looked at the launcher, then at Skinner, then back at the weapon. The words that came out of his mouth would become Army legend. "It sure looks like Bob Burns's bazooka." Bob Burns was one of America's most popular comedians in the 1930s and early 1940s. His trademark prop was a bizarre musical instrument of his own creation, a long tube that produced comical sounds when blown. He called it a bazooka. The name stuck to the musical instrument and moments later to the weapon that would terrify German tank crews across 3 continents. Barnes wasn't just making a joke. He was christening a weapon that would become synonymous with infantry anti-tank warfare for the next 3 decades. That very day, standing on the Aberdeen range with rocket smoke still hanging in the air, Barnes provided a favorable report that led to immediate orders for 5,000 launches into production. Not 5,000 for testing, 5,000 for combat deployment. A few days later at Camp Sims, D.C., General George C. Marshall witnessed a demonstration before high-ranking war and Navy officials, Allied government observers, and British and Russian military observers. Marshall immediately issued verbal orders for 5,000 launchers and 25,000 anti-tank rockets, plus 5,000 practice rockets. General Electric received the contract on May 20th, 1942, with an impossible deadline, 30 days to deliver 5,000 launches. The clock started immediately at G's Bridgeport, Connecticut facilities. Engineers worked around the clock, reverse engineering Skinner and Uhl's prototype. The design was straightforward, which made it ideal for mass production. Steel tube, wooden stock, basic trigger mechanism, simple battery-powered ignition. Nothing exotic, nothing that required specialized manufacturing, just competent metalwork and woodworking at scale. The official designation was Launcher Rocket 236 in anti-tank mode. Nobody called it that. From the factory floor to the front lines, it was the Bazooka. General Electric delivered the order with 89 minutes to spare. 5,000 bazookas ready for deployment, manufactured in one. The weapon received formal designation on June 14, 1942. E.G. Budd Company manufactured the initial 25,000 M6 anti-tank rockets and 5,000 M7 practice rockets, but having the launcher was only half the equation. The rocket itself, designated M6, proved troublesome. Early production rockets suffered from horrific reliability problems. Primers failed to ignite. Fins bent during transport. Propellant charges burned inconsistently, too quickly in hot weather, risking tube burst, too slowly in cold weather, scorching the gunner's face. The shaped charge warhead worked perfectly in laboratory conditions, but proved temperamental in the field. The electrical ignition proved problematic in wet and cold climates. The contact ring system caused structural weakness in the rocket. When it didn't, it was useless. This would become painfully apparent in the weapon's combat debut. November 8, 1942, the beaches of North Africa gleamed under intense Mediterranean sun as Operation Torch, the Allied invasion of French North Africa, commenced. Over 100,000 American and British troops hit beaches at Casablanca, Oran and Algiers simultaneously. It was America's first major offensive operation of the war. Among the forces landing were units from the 1st Infantry Division at Oran, 1st Armored Division Combat Command B at Oran, and the 34th Infantry Division, some equipped with the new Moan bazookas. The night before the landings on November 7, 1942, Supreme Commander Dwight Eisenhower was shocked to learn that none of his troops had received any training on the new weapon. Bazookas had been rushed to North Africa so quickly that many soldiers first saw them when crates were pried open on transport ships. No manuals, no instructors, no practice ammunition, just a tube and some rockets with vague assurances that it could stop tanks. The initial North African fighting was chaotic. French colonial forces loyal to Vichy resisted with unexpected ferocity. German troops rushed reinforcements to Tunisia. American forces, untested in combat, struggled with coordination, leadership, and equipment they barely understood. The bazooka saw little to no meaningful combat use during the torch landings themselves. The weapon that had performed brilliantly at Aberdeen was failing before it even reached the battlefield. The first documented combat use occurred during the Tunisia campaign that followed. The 168th Infantry Regiment of the 34th Infantry Division received their first shipment of bazookas on February 12, 1943, during the Battle of Kasserine Pass. Soldiers learned to use them against German armor attacks on February 14, 1943, under the worst possible circumstances. The bazooka's performance in the Tunisian fighting was dismal. The unreliable M6 rockets misfired constantly. Soldiers who had never trained with the weapon couldn't judge distances or leading angles for moving targets. The electrical firing system proved vulnerable to moisture and rough handling. Battery contacts corroded in the salt air. Rocket propellant absorbed humidity, burning incompletely or not at all. After months of combat in Tunisia, Army ordnance officers compiled a disturbing assessment. An American general visiting the Tunisian front in 1943 after the close of combat operations could not find any soldiers who could report that the weapon had actually stopped an enemy tank. Not a single verified tank kill could be attributed to the bazooka. Soldiers reported firing at enemy armor only to watch rockets bounce off, fail to detonate, or miss entirely. In May 1943, the Army suspended further deployment of the Moan bazooka. The entire program seemed on the verge of cancellation. Millions of dollars invested in a weapon that couldn't accomplish its primary mission. But Skinner, Oul, and the ordnance engineers at Aberdeen refused to give up. They began methodically addressing each failure point. The rocket was redesigned as the M6A1 with a new contact system using wire unspooled from the rear, replacing the nose contact ring that had created structural weakness. Propellant sticks were shortened, reducing peak pressures. The fuse and electrical ignition were improved. The launcher became the Moan A1 with a simplified design that eliminated the forward hand grip, added a face guard at the hand position, included a conical muzzle deflector and carrying strap, revised the safety mechanism, and reduced weight from 18 lb to just 12 and 3/4. The Tiger kill was described in military histories as achieved through an improbable hit, reportedly through the driver's vision slot, though specific details of this engagement, including exact date, location, unit designation, or soldier names, have not been documented in available sources. Gavin's after-action report praised the bazooka's effectiveness when properly employed by trained soldiers against appropriate targets. The weapon had proven itself when used correctly. News of Sicily's success spread rapidly through American forces. Soldiers who had been skeptical after North Africa began requesting bazookas for their units. Training became standardized across all divisions. Tactics were refined and codified. The bazooka was no longer an experimental weapon. It was standard infantry equipment, but the most significant impact was on the enemy. German intelligence officers interrogating captured American soldiers in Tunisia in early 1943 had first learned about the bazooka. Additional examples were captured in late 1942 on the Eastern Front from Soviet Red Army forces who had received them through Lens, and more were captured in February 1943 during continued Tunisian fighting. German ordnance experts examined these specimens with great interest. The shape-charge warhead was sophisticated, using principles German scientists understood well, but the delivery system was brilliantly direct in its approach. The Germans immediately began developing their own version. By 1943, German troops were using the Raketon Panzerbuka 43 with the improved RPZB-54 model entering service in February 1944. Nicknamed the Panzer Schreck or Tank Terror and officially designated often Ra or stovepipe due to the copious smoke it produced. The weapon was essentially a scaled-up bazooka. It increased the warhead diameter from 60 mm to 88 mm, enabling armor penetration of 160 to 230 mm depending on conditions, roughly double the American bazooka's 76 to 102 mm capability. The Germans had copied the design so closely that American soldiers could recognize it immediately. But the Panzer Schreck had significant drawbacks. Unlike American bazooka rockets, which burned their propellant completely within the launch tube, Panzer Schreck rockets continued burning for 2 after leaving the muzzle. This created an enormous backblast that could seriously burn the operator. German soldiers had to wear protective ponchos, heavy gloves, and gas masks without filters when firing. Later models added a blast shield, but this made the weapon heavier at 24 lb compared to the Moan A1's 13 lb. In combat, that weight difference mattered enormously. American bazooka teams could move quickly, take a shot, and relocate before enemy forces could react. Panzer Schreck teams burdened with protective equipment and a heavier weapon were less mobile. The massive backblast also created enormous smoke clouds, revealing the shooter's position to every enemy within visual range. Approximately 300,000 Panzer Schrecks were produced during the war. As 1943 turned to 1944, the bazooka underwent continuous improvement. The M9 model, introduced in October 1943, featured a two-piece design that broke down for easier transport, crucial for airborne operations. The assembled length was 61 in, disassembled 31.5 in. Weight was approximately 15.87 lb unloaded. Metal furniture replaced wood. Most significantly, a new Magnavox 6 trigger magneto replaced the troublesome battery ignition system, eliminating countless malfunctions. The General Electric T43 aperture sight was replaced in September 1944 with the Polaroid T90 optical reflector sight. Rate of fire increased to 10 rounds per minute. Production totaled 26,087 mine units. The improved M9A1 was introduced in June 1944 with better coupling mechanisms for the launch tubes. This became the most numerous variant with 277,819 units produced by war's end. Most importantly, the M6A3 rocket entered production in late 1943 with a blunt hemispherical nose that prevented deflection of sloped armor. The new circular fin assembly improved flight, stability, more effective shape-charge standoff, and improved propellant made it more reliable across temperature ranges. This rocket could penetrate 3.5 to 4 in 89 to 102 ms of armor plate reliably at effective ranges of 250 to 300 yd. Soldiers who had cursed the bazooka's early unreliability now praised its effectiveness. The weapon became particularly valuable in the Italian campaign, where mountainous terrain favored defensive positions and made tank warfare difficult. German forces fortified villages on hillsides using narrow valleys as killing zones. American infantry, advancing through these valleys, faced machine gun nests, mortar positions, and dug-in armor in prepared positions. Bazookas proved ideal for this environment. The weapon could engage fortifications at ranges up to 300 yd, far beyond grenade throwing distance. High-explosive anti-tank rounds destroyed machine gun positions and light vehicles. The versatility exceeded original design parameters. At Cassino in early 1944, where Allied forces battered themselves against German defenses for months, bazookas were used more often against fortifications than against tanks. A rocket that could blow a hole through 4 in of steel plate could also demolish reinforced concrete emplacements. But the bazooka's greatest test came on June 6, 1944. D-Day, American forces storming Omaha Beach carried bazookas ashore in the first waves, under intense German fire with men dying by the hundreds in the surf and on the sand. Bazooka teams advanced toward German strong points. The weapons proved crucial for reducing fortified positions that had pinned down entire companies. Engineers used bazookas to blast paths through obstacles. Infantry used them to suppress machine gun bunkers long enough for flamethrower teams to close in. In the weeks following D-Day, as Allied forces pushed through the Norman Boche country, bazookas became essential for dealing with German armor ambushing from concealed positions. The thick hedge of Normandy created a claustrophobic battlefield where combat occurred at ranges measured in yards, not hundreds of yards. In this environment, the bazooka's portable firepower was life-saving, but German armor was evolving. The Panther tank's sloped frontal armor could deflect even improved Mi-63 rockets at anything but point-blank range. Tigers remained nearly impervious from the front. American soldiers learned to work in teams with riflemen, suppressing enemy infantry, while bazooka teams maneuvered for side shots. General George Patton, commanding 3rd Army, wrote that the purpose of the bazooka was to be used as a last resort in keeping tanks from overrunning infantry with range held to around 30 yard, less than 100 feet. At that distance, a tank's machine guns could shred a bazooka team in seconds. The mortality rate among bazooka operators was sobering. Men assigned to anti-tank duty knew they were being asked to advance toward enemy armor that could kill them from hundreds of yards away. Yet volunteers never lacked. One of the war's most remarkable bazooka stories involves Lieutenant Colonel Charles M. Carpenter, born August 29, 1912 in rural Illinois. Carpenter grew up in Reynolds near Edgington. His family lost their farm during the Great Depression. Educated on scholarships at Roosevelt Military Academy and Center College, Kentucky. He worked as a history teacher at Moline High School before the war. He enlisted in 1942 as second lieutenant, completed flight training with artillery liaison wings, and arrived in France in 1944, assigned to the 4th Armored Division, General George Patton's 3rd Army, as artillery spotter and reconnaissance pilot. Carpenter flew an L-4 Grasshopper observation plane serial number 4330,426, which he nicknamed Rosie the Rocketer in homage to Rosie the Riveter. He mounted 6 Moan A-1 bazookas, later upgraded to man models, 3 launches per side on plywood boards fixed to outboard wing struts. Total weight when loaded was approximately 106 lb. He wired them to the cockpit with an electrical firing system, installing a control panel with push-button switches, allowing individual or salvo firing. Carpenter typically flew solo to maximize performance. His attack profile involved diving from altitude to approximately 100 m above target, firing rockets, then pulling up steeply to escape return fire. The plunging fire attacked the thinner top armor of tanks, which measured 40 to 45 mm on Tiger turret tops versus 100 mm or frontal armor. Carpenter is officially credited with destroying 6 tanks, including 2 Tiger I heavy tanks. Witness accounts claim 14 tanks destroyed, but the official number stands at 6. His first major success came on September 20, 1944, at the Battle of Aricourt, where he was credited with destroying 1 German armored car and 4 tanks in a single day across 3 sorties, firing 16 rockets. In October 1944, he destroyed 4 additional tanks and an armored truck. Carpenter received the Silver Star awarded by General George S. Patton for gallantry in ground action. The Bronze Star Medal, Air Medal with Oak Leaf Cluster, European African Middle Eastern Campaign Medal with 4 campaign stars, American Campaign Medal and World War II Victory Medal and World War II Victory Medal. He was featured in Stars and Stripes, Associated Press, Popular Science in February 1945, The New York Sun and Liberty magazine. In Stars and Stripes, he was quoted saying, "Word must be getting around to watch out for cubs with bazookas on them. Every time I show up now, they shoot with everything they have. They never used to bother cubs. Bazookas must be bothering them a bit." Carpenter was diagnosed with Hodgkin's lymphoma in 1946 and given a 2-year prognosis. He returned to teaching at Urbana High School, Illinois, and lived until March 22, 1966. Approximately 19 years beyond his prognosis. His aircraft, Rosie the Rocketer, serial 4330,426, was restored and has been displayed at the American Heritage Museum in Hudson, Massachusetts since 2020. His daughter, Carol Carpenter Oki, co-authored a 2020 biography, Bazooka Charlie, the unbelievable story of Major Charles Carpenter and Rosie the Rocketer. Other remarkable accounts emerged from the war. Private First Class Francis Sherman, Curry of Company K, 120th Infantry Regiment, 31st Infantry Division, earned the Medal of Honor for actions on December 21, 1944, at Malmedy, Belgium, when German tanks overran American positions. Curry and 5 soldiers withdrew into an abandoned factory. Finding a bazooka without ammunition, Curry ran across the street under heavy fire to secure rockets from an abandoned half-track. His Medal of Honor citation reads, "Sergeant Curry found a bazooka in the building and crossed the street to secure rockets, meanwhile enduring intense fire from enemy tanks and hostile infantrymen who had taken up a position at a house a short distance away." In the face of small arms, machine gun and artillery fire, he, with a companion, knocked out a tank with 1 shot. Curry later stated that by what he would call a miracle, the rocket hit the exact spot where the turret joined the chassis and disabled the vehicle. Curry lived until October 8, 2019, and gave multiple interviews throughout his life. First Lieutenant Waverley Wright, Deacon Ray of Company D, 505th Parachute Infantry Regiment, 82nd Airborne Division, led a bazooka team against German positions near a railway bridge in Normandy in June 1944, when rounds fell short. He took the bazooka himself and moved closer to get within effective range. He was struck by machine gun fire and died of his wounds. Lieutenant Colonel Van der Voort considered WWII the 82nd Airborne Division's undiscovered World War II equivalent of Sergeant Alvin C. York. Albert Dargo, 19 years old, and a member of a 90-mum anti-aircraft gun crew, volunteered with Roland Seaman on December 19, 1944, near Stuurmont, Belgium, when Brass sought volunteers to go after German tanks. Durago had never fired a bazooka before. In a 2014 Washington Post interview at age 89, he recalled, "I knew I was going to get it before I got down there, but God was with me." After hitting one of 4 German tanks backed by infantry, he said, "I pulled the trigger, and you never heard such a racket and noise when that thing hit. I heard them hollering and screaming. The lieutenant asked him to make sure, and he went down again with a reloaded weapon." Wilbur Bill Bruner, serving with Army engineers, used his main bazooka in 1945 near Dortmund, Germany, to destroy a German half-track blocking Autobahn underpasses. In a 2004 oral history with the Veterans History Project at the Library of Congress, he stated, "It must have had ammunition because it blew, I'd say, 100 FT in the air, but it blew up. I was glad we weren't any closer than we were." On January 4, 1945, during Operation Nordwind near Rimling, France in Alsace, Jagdtiger No. 134, the heaviest armored fighting vehicle in World War II at 79 tons, was struck in vulnerable side armor by either a bazooka or M36 tank destroyer. This caused an ammunition detonation that killed the entire crew, marking the first Jagdtiger lost in combat. Despite 250 Mr. Menschú frontal armor that was practically invulnerable, the side armor measured only 80 mm during the Battle of the Bulge on December 17 to 18, 1944, at the twin villages of Krinkel-Roserath and the crossroads of Lale in the Ardennes. Bazookas accounted for knocking out over 20 German armored vehicles. While not the deciding factor in the American ability to hold these key points, it demonstrated the weapon's effectiveness in desperate close combat. In the Pacific Theater, the bazooka faced different challenges. Japanese tanks were lighter and more thinly armored than German vehicles, making them easier targets. But Japanese defensive tactics emphasized bunkers, caves, and fortified positions, rather than mobile armored warfare. American Marines and Army troops used bazookas primarily against fortifications. The weapon proved ideal for destroying Japanese pillboxes without requiring soldiers to close to suicidal ranges. White phosphorus rockets were particularly effective against caves and bunkers, as the burning phosphorus created toxic smoke that forced defenders out into the open. On Uema and Okinawa, bazooka teams worked closely with flamethrower units, using rockets to blow open fortified positions that flamethrowers then cleared. However, the Pacific's climate posed unique problems. Heat and humidity wreaked havoc on the bazooka's electrical system in MON and MON A1 models. Soldiers experienced frequent misfires. The rubber grips deteriorated rapidly. Metal components corroded despite protective coatings. The M9's magneto ignition proved more reliable than the earlier battery system, but problems persisted. By war's end in August 1945, American forces had accumulated vast experience with shoulder-fired rocket launchers. From June 1942 through May 1945, American industry manufactured 476,628 bazookas of all models. The production breakdown was MON, with 112,790 units produced from June 1942 to August 1943. MON A1, with 59,932 units from July to October 1943. MON 9 with 26,087 units from October 1943 to June 1944. MON A1 with 277,819 units from June 1944 to May 1945. and mating with only 500 units produced from April to August 1945, of which only 350 saw combat. General Electric produced approximately 91.6% of all bazookas. Cheney Bigelow Wire Works of Springfield, Massachusetts manufactured approximately 40,000 Marine A-1 launches under a June 1944 contract worth $1,863,000, winning the Army-Navy E Award 3 times during World War II. Rocket production was even more impressive. 1,563,000 rounds manufactured by war's end, including all types such as heat, practice, and smoke variants. The weapon's design made it ideal for rapid training of Allied forces. Free French forces received 11,350 units, becoming the largest foreign operator. The Soviet Union received approximately 3,000 units through Lend-Lease, though they held them in low regard compared to anti-tank rifles. Brazil received approximately 2,900 units. The United Kingdom 2,100 units, China 2,000 units, Canada approximately 170 units, and Czechoslovak insurgents received 162 units, delivered via airlift during the Slovak national uprising in September-October 1944. As the war entered its final months, a troubling reality emerged. German tanks were becoming increasingly difficult to kill with the 2.36 in Bazooka. The Panther's sloped armor was resistant even to side shots unless taken at optimal angles. The Tiger II, introduced in late 1944, was essentially impervious to bazookas except at the rear. American ordnance engineers recognized the problem. In October 1944, after examining captured German Panzer Schrecks, work began on a completely redesigned weapon designated the M20 Super Bazooka. The M20 featured an 88.9 3.5 in caliber, matching the German weapon's diameter. The launcher was constructed of two-piece aluminum alloy, measured 60 in assembled or approximately 33 in disassembled, and weighed 14.3 lb unloaded. It featured a magneto-type firing device in the trigger grip and a reflecting optical sight. The M28A2 rocket could penetrate 11 in 280 meters of armor, nearly double the 2.6 inversion's capability. Effective range was 150 m against moving targets and 275 to 300 m against stationary targets with a rate of fire of 6 rounds per minute. The M20 was designated in late 1944, with small-scale production beginning in 1948. Critically, the M20 saw no combat use in World War II. Development came too late. The war in Europe ended in May 1945 before the weapon could be deployed to combat units. In the Pacific, where Japanese tanks were lighter and the fighting focused more on fortifications, the original 236 in Bazooka remained adequate through Japan's surrender in August 1945. That expertise would prove valuable sooner than anyone expected. 5 years later, on June 25, 1950, North Korean forces, equipped with approximately 150 Soviet-supplied T-3485 tanks, poured across the 38th parallel into South Korea. American forces, caught unprepared and under strength, desperately needed weapons to stop them. South Korea had 1958 M9 Atwells. 36 in bazookas, their only anti-tank weapons in quantity. They proved critically ineffective against the T-3485's frontal armor, which measured 90 to 100 mm. On July 5, 1950, Task Force Smith, consisting of 406 U.S. soldiers, faced approximately 5,000 North Koreans, supported by 33 to 36 T-34 to 85 tanks. Armed with 6 Marine A1 bazookas, they fired 22 rockets with zero effect on the T-34s. The rockets literally bounced off the tank armor. The task force was routed. Colonel Robert Martin of the 24th Infantry Division was killed on July 8, 1950, attempting to stop a T-34 with a Tusu 32 in bazooka. On July 8, 1950, day 13 of the war, General Douglas MacArthur requested urgent shipment of the M20 Super Bazooka. Rock Island Arsenal shipped the first M20s to Korea, accompanied by instructors from Fort Benning. Training manuals were hastily written in just 2 weeks. The first combat use occurred at the Battle of Tijon on July 20th, 1950, when the 24th Infantry Division received the first consignment. The results were immediate and dramatic. The M20 was credited with destroying 8 T-34 tanks on its first day of combat use. Magazine reported it knocked out 7 tanks in 7 tries. Major General William F. Dean personally used the M20 against T-34s during the battle, engaging a T-34 from a second-story window at less than 10 yards range. He hit the turret ring, set the tank on fire, and killed the crew. Of 10 T-34s in the city that day, 6 were destroyed by M20s and 2 by artillery. Dean was later awarded the Medal of Honor, the first of the Korean War, for actions including his bazooka use. He was captured after the battle and held as a prisoner of war until September 1953. Over 750 M20s were produced and shipped to Korea in the first year. The improved M20A1 entered service in 1952 with an improved connector latch assembly and became the main production version. The M20B1 featured cast aluminum barrel and simplified internals for lighter weight. The M20A1 combined the M20B1 features with M2A1 improvements. Throughout the Korean War, the Super Bazooka proved its worth, destroying hundreds of enemy tanks and fortifications. But even the M20 was approaching obsolescence. Tank armor continued to improve. Shaped charge warheads required ever larger diameters to maintain penetration capability. The reloadable bazooka, requiring a 2-man team and multiple rockets, was giving way to single-use, disposable launchers. By the mid-1960s, as American forces deployed to Vietnam, the bazooka era was ending. The M72 Law light anti-armor weapon offered similar capability in a package 1/3 the weight, requiring only 1 soldier with no reloading. The bazooka soldiered on in limited use through the early years of Vietnam, particularly against fortified positions, but gradually faded from American arsenals. Yet the concept Skinner and Uhl pioneered in 1942 remains fundamental to modern infantry warfare. Every army on Earth fields shoulder-fired rocket launchers descended from the bazooka. The IT-4, the RPG-7, the Main 136, the Panzerfaust III, and dozens of modern weapons all trace their lineage to that crude tube, all spotted on a scrap pile. The shaped charge warhead remains the primary method for defeating tank armor at infantry ranges. The psychological impact was as important as the technical specifications. Before 1942, tanks were nearly invulnerable to individual infantrymen. The bazooka changed that calculation. So, suddenly, 2 men with 50 lb of equipment could destroy a 50-ton vehicle. Tank crews could no longer ignore infantry. This fundamentally altered tactical doctrine. Combined arms doctrine became absolutely essential. Tanks operating without infantry cover were suicidally vulnerable. Corporal Donald E. and Louis, who participated in armor penetration tests involving a German Panther tank using both the German RPG B-54 Panzerschreck and the US M9 bazooka, stated, "I was so favorably impressed by the Panzerschreck, I was ready to take after the Krauts with their own weapon." He informed superiors the Panzerschreck was far superior to the American bazooka, demonstrating that American forces recognized the limitations of their weapon even as they used it effectively. When Leslie Skinner died on November 2, 1978 at age 78 in Clearwater, Florida, obituaries across America credited him with co-inventing one of World War II most influential weapons. After the war, he was sent to the Pacific Theater in July 1945 to organize ordnance supply. In 1945, he was assigned to California Institute of Technology to establish an ordnance sub-office. He retired from the Army as a colonel in 1948 with the Legion of Merit, then joined Aerojet Engineering Corporation in Rancho Cordova, California. In 1950, he was recalled for the Korean War and commissioned in the U.S. Air Force, establishing a weapons test facility at Eglin Air Force Base, Florida from 1950 to 1952. After his second military retirement in 1952, he worked as a consultant for Ehrlichen Group weapons manufacturing until 1970. He then moved to Bear Bluffs, Florida, and took up sculpture, channeling his creative energy into art. He was buried at Arlington National Cemetery and received the Hickman Award from the American Rocket Society. Edward WWII lived longer, passing away on May 9, 2010 at age 92 in Oxford, Maryland, from complications of a stroke. After leaving the U.S. Army in 1947 as lieutenant colonel, he worked for Glenn L. Martin Company, then Martin Marietta, from 1947 to 1959 on guided missile projects, eventually becoming vice president of engineering. From 1959 to 1961, he served as vice president of Ryan Aeronautical Company. In 1961, WWII joined Fairchild Engine and Airplane Company, later Fairchild Industries, as president. He was named chairman in 1976. From 1961 to 1985, he oversaw the transformation from military aircraft manufacturer to aerospace Fortune 500 company. Major programs under his leadership included the Matador Bullpup and Pershing missiles, the Phone 105 and Acton Thunderbolt II aircraft, and the Pegasus at S6 and TDRS satellites. He retired as chairman in 1985. WWII married Maureen Barbara Kelleher in 1943 and had 4 children, including 2 sons who attended his alma mater Lehigh University. In interviews during his final years, maintained that the Bazooka's success came from necessity and direct problem solving. "We really had no anti-tank weapon," he told Maryland Cracker Barrel magazine in 2007. "You can't believe how inept our military was at that point in time." That statement carried weight. The American military of 1941 was woefully unprepared for modern warfare. By 1945, it was the most powerful military force in human history. Weapons like the bazooka made that transformation possible. In 1985, at a reunion in Germany for veterans of the European campaign, a remarkable moment occurred. A former German Panther tank commander approached an American veteran who had carried a bazooka through France and Germany. Through a translator, the German said, "We feared your tube rocket more than your tanks. Your Sherman tanks we could destroy easily, but your rockets, they came from anywhere, from soldiers we could not see until too late. Many times we abandoned tanks that were not damaged just because we heard the sound of your rockets nearby." The American asked, "Why?" The Germans smiled sadly because we knew that the next rocket might come through our vision slot, or strike our engine, or catch us from behind. We were always looking over our shoulders.